Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won, real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Brian Kisida. Brian Kisida is an associate professor in the Truman School of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Missouri, co-director of the Arts, Humanities, and Civic Engagement Lab, and director of the Open Minds Initiative. We discuss his recent research on K-12 education, which cuts through the political noise on what is and is not being taught in high schools about race and critical race theory. We also discuss his work on promoting viewpoint diversity in the classroom and his perspective on broader national debates about higher education reform. We compare notes from our positive experiences at flagship public universities, and we contrast these to some of the news stories out of elite universities. Brian Kisida, welcome to Grounded Not Divided.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're a really interesting person to talk to for a number of reasons on the issue of what are the challenges that higher ed is facing right now and how has higher ed been addressing it in some places and how might it better address it, including what role the government does or doesn't have in addressing that. But let's back up first. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? How did you get into the field of education policy? And describe some of the things that you're doing today at Mizzou.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up. My family was one of those families that moved around quite a bit, but most of my formative years were spent growing up in southern Arkansas in a fairly, I would say, a fairly isolated, very religious small town community. And that was definitely a formative experience in the sense that I didn't fit there. I think I've always had a natural inclination to want to question things and want to seek truth, and that didn't go over so well in Fountain Lake, Arkansas. So I was literally kicked out of my 10th grade biology class for arguing with my teacher because my biology teacher in high school taught creationism. So I ended up having to spend the rest of that semester in the library for being a dissident. And I was one of these. So I was one of these kids that didn't really fit in with the mainstream. I found skateboarding and skateboarding culture as an outlet, and spent a lot of time reading and spent a lot of time in the library. And it was really things like discovering things like George Orwell and Douglas Adams and just like other sort of like free thinking type of literature that kind of gave me some comfort that I wasn't alone in this world. You have to remember, I mean, this is kind of pre-internet. So when you're in a small town in a very closed off sort of society, a town that had banned MTV, you don't really know what's going on in the outside world, and you don't really know that there's a place for you. I ended up getting a scholarship to the state university. And that was really great because suddenly I was in an environment where those things were not frowned upon, but celebrated a little bit more. I was the leader of an undergraduate student organization, the Campus Free Thinkers, and we brought in speakers to talk about separation of church and state and various other sort of issues related to government intrusion on speech. So this thread was kind of always with me. And as a young 18-year-old, I was committed to one thing, which, many things, but my North Star was, I want to learn truth. And so that made me think I was going to be actually like a biology major, because I figured, those things are true. And then I sort of gravitated towards astronomy. Is like, I'll learn about the universe. But it ended up being actually in my literature class where we were looking at the other types of truth, right? The types of qualitative truths that make us stay awake late at night, wondering what the purpose of existence is and what is consciousness. I had an amazing philosophy teacher. So from that, I kind of blended the science and the philosophy by being a political science major. And then in the early days of my political science career, I thought, well, I'm just going to prove that we can make better decisions if people are more informed. And so I was one of these early political scientists that was studying the effects of facts on opinions and policy preferences. And kind of turned out to be a dead end for a couple of reasons. One reason is I was incredibly frustrated with sort of what you might consider, I think, standard academia, which is academics talking to each other and having no real effect on the actual day-to-day world. The other thing is, I think that line of research, the idea that facts matter, um, I think is maybe a bit of a kind of misses the point. I'm much more convinced now that it's values and principles that matter. Um, and facts don't do a lot to change people's priors when it comes to what the moral foundations of their beliefs are. So I started gravitating towards that, and then sort of wrapped that all up by coming to terms with I would rather work in a policy space where I might be able to use the research that I was doing to have an effect on the world. And education policy seemed to be a very natural place because uh, with this background in political science and with this strong interest in government and democracy, how could we make sure that we were producing the best citizens possible? Well, let's focus on education. So I became an education policy scholar, and that's basically where I spent my energy for most of my academic career.
And just to back up, for those who are not familiar with the inner workings of education policy academia,
Yeah.
what what departments are you in? So kind of walk me through in grad school, are you in a school of ed? Are you in a policy school? Uh, Obviously now you are in a policy school. Walk me through that because that may come up later as something that's relevant to understanding academia today, that there really are some differences in different fields.
There's a lot to unpack there. What basically happened is, again, so not to create the whole David Copperfield story, but it's a reference to Salinger for the non-readers out there. I didn't have a lot of guidance. I'm a first generation college student, so when it came time to get a PhD, it just happened to coincide with the establishment of a new Department of Education reform that was established by a $20 million endowment at the University of Arkansas. So I actually started working there and got my PhD through that. And the department was founded in 2004 and specifically created to be something that ran against the grain of what was happening in most ed schools in terms of not just raising the level of scholarship. I mean, we did lean into things like randomized experiments, randomized control trials, and moving past descriptive evidence. I was part of one of the first randomized control trials contracted by the Federal Department of Education that ever existed. And so, kind of really at the cusp of trying to use evidence based policymaking. But on top of that, this department was created by hiring a lot of national figures from other places that had reform mindsets. So these are people like Patrick Wolf and Jay Green and Robert Castrell, people that you probably wouldn't know outside of education policy circles, but not the most popular people in terms of mainstream education research,
As reformers
because
tend not to be, right?
not I did. I was surprised at how this went. I didn't know how this would go, but yeah. I mean, education policy, education research, education conferences, that entire wing of the academy. When we step back and we look at the intense debate right now over how insulated and how far left or how ideologically progressive higher ed is. I think you and I can talk about what is the real truth behind that, and whether or not the fights that we're seeing on campuses like Harvard and Columbia are representative of the faculty there, or even representative of higher ed generally. In education, a lot of us have been, in our own little world, been doing this and dealing with it for a long time. So it's always been incredibly, I still think that things like critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion, and in putting pronouns in your bio, um, it's actually quite odd for those of us in education policy to see these things being talked about in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because those were because they were a part of our world 20 years ago. I mean, you can look around college campuses and try to examine the origins of um, what we might call the progressive sort of like woke mindset. And I certainly don't want to denigrate all my colleagues. There's a lot of people doing a lot of amazing work, but it would be a lie to say that this isn't one of the places where those ideas have been especially common and especially uh, orthodox in the way that they've been handled.
For a longer time, right? So
Quite a while, yes.
the the origins of many of these ideas come from schools of ed, to a somewhat lesser extent schools of law, right? And not only that, isn't it the case that critics, for example, of whatever you want to call this movement, have pointed out that non-academic staff have been a big part of uh, pushing it forward, right? Sam Abrams has written about that, for example. And isn't it the case that many non-academic staff in, say, student affairs come from the schools of ed, like literally get their degrees and are trained at schools of ed? So in a lot of ways, schools of ed are, whether you like it or not, kind of the epicenter of this movement that people are now talking about, especially for the last 5 to 10 years. Is that fair?
Well, I'm an empiricist, so I would need to see some data to be sure of that. But that's definitely my anecdotal experience. That's not to say that critical studies don't exist across the academy. I mean, sociology's had critical studies and lots of different branches outside of critical studies. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with critical studies. It's the idea that critical studies are like the main thing that we're working on. And when I mean critical studies, right, I mean like things that are trying to um, tear down, established institutions, many of which we should tear down. I mean, when we talk about attacking the patriarchy or attacking, uh, white supremacy or the various, institutions that the left has come after, there's a good reason that we should have guardrails, and ways for institutions to change and to become better. But I think too often critical studies are about the tearing down and not about the replacement or the building up. So you end up with a vacuum. That's a little bit of a tangent on critical studies.
What
Yeah,
needs to be torn down, I think, is another thing that's been controversial about critical studies. So, for example,
right.
I believe it's the case at the beginning of the Delgado and Stefanchich canonical book on critical race theory. They're quite explicit about thinking that we need to tear down, um, markets and neutrally applied laws as sort of two examples, and possibly free expression. Although I can't remember specifically if it's been a few years since I've read that book.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, right. I mean, you remember when the Harper's letter came out, there was the response to the Harper's
Right.
letter, which literally said, free expression is a tool used by the powerful to oppress others. And that seems to be turning the world on its head. I mean, that doesn't quite make sense. But so, there are other smaller of communities in ed policy. There are different conferences, and by no means do I think that it's all problematic. But um, it is just one of those things where, and I'm not in an ed school, I'm in a policy school. So when I engage, and there's a lot of great people that I know in ed schools, I don't want them to hear this and think this, but the ones who understand, and most of them do realize that it's a problem. A problem big enough that there's a lot of people when Trump canceled the slashed the Department of Education's budget and canceled so many grants. I had a grant canceled by Doge. I think we were doing good work. I think it was, you
What
know,
was it on?
we run a research lab looking at how the arts and the humanities build social capital with kids in Houston. I mean, I think it was a good project, and we were running experimental data with randomly assigning schools. But that's the problem: is Doge didn't use a scalpel; they used a sledgehammer. Um,
Right.
but I know a lot of people, including prominent people, who wrote public pieces saying, this is kind of what you did. You've politicized your field so much, and when you enter the world of politics, politics fights back.
Yeah, Lee Jussim has this whole compendium of articles that he calls "We Tried to Warn You."
Yes, yes, I know, I
Uh,
know. But there's very little internalization amongst a huge wing of those people that that there was anything that they did wrong.
Okay, I want to come back to broader reform, but maybe just to put a finer point on what you were saying about, because we're not going to do a whole podcast on critical studies, but maybe just to put a fine point on what I think where you're coming down is, and correct me if I'm wrong, on kind of what the problem is or isn't, is I would frame it as megaphones and gavels. So
Hmm.
based on this pretty famous, I believe it was in Harvard Law Review around 2015 article um, on feminism called "Trading the Megaphone for the Gavel," and basically the idea was you can, if you have a critical movement that's pushing back against what it sees as hegemonic power that's being abused, then there are rhetorical and intellectual moves that can be useful for a critical movement, like rejecting nuance in some circumstances to make your message clear, caring more about the interests of some group than others, because those are the groups that that are being disadvantaged, that you're trying to lift up. But those moves can become problematic once you're in charge. And so the point of this Harvard Law Review article was, feminism on campus is in charge now, and so it needs to trade the megaphone for the gavel. Um, and so I guess the way I've often thought about critical studies is that it's explicitly, I think, a megaphone field, and that has a role to play in our society. Criticism has a role to play in our society, but
Absolutely.
maybe where it's become problematic on campuses in the last decade in particular is where it's started to move into more gavelly roles, in student affairs, in administration, influencing policy, for the whole university, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a fair characterization of what you were getting at, or am I off base?
No, I mean, I think that's a really great insight. I'd have to think about it, deeper to like apply it to all the situations I've experienced. But I think that I think another important thing to talk about here is just the siloed nature of being in some of these spaces that have no viewpoint diversity, and sort of just kind of how wild it can be to have conversations with people who have never stepped outside of their bubble. And
Sure.
that is very much the case when you enter some of these spaces. And so I don't know that I don't know that there's a whole lot of order to, or strategy to any of it. So much of it just seems virtue signaling to fit in because that's the way that culture talks. Can I give you an example of this article that we just wrote?
Sure. And then I want to come back to, because I want to come back to where you are and what you're doing, and then circle
Sure.
back to the broader reform conversation. But go ahead.
But so critical race theory is obviously a topic that's pretty hot right now. So me and six other people recently did a survey of high school students because we are mostly, I mean, we have people that lean right and left on this research team, but we are mostly uh, interested in truth and not interested in making decisions based off of anecdotes and what's going on. And it seems to us that the way the critical race theory debate had been unfolding was, on the right we were able to find examples. Somebody caught somebody on camera, somebody found a document of some pretty wild things happening in classrooms from time to time. There was the woke kindergarten scandal in San Francisco where they were basically teaching kindergarteners that America was built on stolen land and had no right to exist. Like, there's not many
Right.
people that are going to defend that. And then on the other side, the left was saying critical race theory is an obscure legal theory. It doesn't happen in schools. And so I think neither of those narratives are true. So we actually surveyed high school students and we asked them, how often did your teachers make the following claims? And we went to the exact claims that critics had made. Are they teaching you that America is a fundamentally racist nation, or that we have this whole battery of questions that are kind of borrowed from the sort of Rufo narrative of the way public schools are engaging in things, and our results basically were nuanced. Yes,
Right.
there's about a third of students who hear some of these messages, but half of those are also hearing that America's made a lot of progress. So it seems like by and large students are getting a balanced view of America's history in terms of race, and a small fraction are maybe getting a very biased view, and really the largest percentage are really getting nothing at all, right? I think that schools are just avoiding this.
So let me just give I have it in front of me, so let me just give us a couple of specific numbers. So 58% of students reported hearing often or almost daily that we must be actively anti-racist. That sounds pretty woke. But then 56% reported hearing the US, again, often or almost daily, the US has made a lot of progress toward racial equality over the last 50 years, which sounds, pretty uh cognizant of progress that's happened.
Right.
um, when you start to get to maybe more controversial specific uh, questions, right? America is a fundamentally racist nation. Just over a third heard that regularly. About a third, just under a third, never heard that. um, Police officers are inherently racist against Black Americans, which, as far as I understand, is empirically debated, right? With some evidence maybe on both sides, depending on how you frame it. Again, it's about a third, a third, a third, never, often, or rarely. Um, Employers should give Black applicants an advantage in the hiring process. Over half said they'd never heard that. And separating students by race for purposes of small group conversations about race, almost three quarters had never seen that. So those are just some examples that I think illustrate what you're saying, that like, yeah, there's some, but it's not everywhere and everything. It's not like we're having a kindergarten intifada, in all 50 states.
Oh, yeah. And there's a lot of other data, in the journal article
Yeah,
that we look at, like in terms of the sort of like war on public school teachers, and that have been caught up in the culture wars. I think this is completely misguided. I mean, teachers actually tend to be fairly split in terms of Democrats and Republicans. They are not. They do not look like higher ed. You've got rural teachers and religious communities all over this country. But the point I wanted to get to is we wrote up a journal, a peer reviewed journal version of this, not the one you're reading, which is more of like a popular version of it.
sure.
And we got desk rejected. And so desk rejected means and this is a top education journal by the leader of the main education research organization, the American Education Research Association. So desk rejected means we don't think this is good enough to send out to reviewers. And I've published enough in my life. I know what warrants being sent out to reviewers and what doesn't.
Right.
And this was clearly wrong. And we asked them, what you could, if they could explain why. And they first said, well, we think it's good work and we think your findings are helpful. But the article, quote, operationalizes contentious claims in ways that may unintentionally validate them. Well, didn't quite understand what that meant. We asked for more clarification. And they said, by measuring student exposure to terms like white privilege or Black Lives Matter as indicators of potential indoctrination, the study risks validating the premise that mentioning these concepts is inherently problematic, essentially adopting the critic's framing rather than interrogating it. So, because we specifically took a balanced approach and said, we're going to look at what critics are claiming and we're going to find data to shed light on this, we were desk rejected for even platforming the question that people should care about whether these things are happening.
I mean, academia works, I think, mostly well on the basis of peer review, right? The idea that you publish, that your peers evaluate, help you, hold you to high standards of rigor and evaluate you, and the fact that your peers evaluate you also mean that you're insulated from external political pressures, right? These are all foundational aspects of the academy that are important, but the vice that they lend themselves to is insularity. And you've given an example from your field. There's many other examples. Certainly environmental research. I could give you lots of examples of that.
Yeah.
Let me come back to kind of a larger meta question that I think a lot of people who don't know your field very well and have just observed this debate as it's played out in the news will be curious about. And that's the following apparent tension in facts. So, on the one hand, I think I heard you say that schools of education, really are in many places uh, quite politically extreme compared to the general public.
Yes.
and do want to promulgate their political agendas, including through the school system. Some of the foundational texts, like the Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, is quite explicit about that. Uh, and yet, you also said, which also matches my anecdotal experience, that teachers as a whole are in K-12 are politically diverse. Most of them just want to help kids learn and are not interested in promulgating political agendas. So, how do you reconcile that tension? Is it just sort of basically that you get an education degree to teach and you kind of tune it out if you're not interested in the political parts of it? Or is it that you can get a teaching certificate without kind of engaging in the more esoteric, politicized uh, research aspects of the education field?
I imagine there's a lot of tuning it out going on. I mean, there's definitely alternative certification where, you were undergraduate math major, a biology major, and you can find other pathways to the classroom. I imagine if you go through a standard college of education, and look, the elite institutions are among the worst. I mean, go look at some of the curriculum at elite institutions and what they're teaching in their ed schools, and it'll be more, I think, eye opening than if you just look at a normal flagship university in the middle of the country. So I think a lot of them tune it out, and I think the unfortunate part here politically, though, is that. I think that the academy thinks that they speak on behalf of teachers, and they kind of adopt this role. And I think that this kind of puts teachers in the crosshairs unnecessarily. We actually put a question in the field just recently, and we asked teachers. We literally asked a representative sample of teachers what they thought about some of the bans on critical race theory, which to be clear, really never actually talk about banning critical race theory.
Sure.
They ban a lot of these. There's a long list of things about, yeah, don't teach that one. Some people have more whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
some races are inherently good or bad,
Right,
inherently
right, right.
oppressive or oppressed.
If you read them, you would think there was nothing that controversial about most of them. But we asked a representative sample of teachers if they supported those bans. Well, 33% of them do. um, and another 20% said, we don't really think they're necessary because we don't see a lot of this. Only
Right.
like 17% said these bans are terrible because this stuff is important.
So that really starkly illustrates the divide you're talking about, that,
Yeah.
teachers on the ground, what they're doing in their classrooms, which is, I think, really what parents care about, is quite far removed often from what's going on in schools of education, which in some cases is bad or worse than, what Republicans on TV are saying it is. Is that fair?
It's completely fair.
Okay.
And not just schools of education, but the other sort of like apparatus around them. I mean,
Yeah.
the professional associations and the union.
But in the context of the education field. Okay, I want to
Right. Yeah.
back
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked about your time at University of Arkansas.
Yes.
Now you're at University of Missouri.
Yes.
You run a really interesting initiative um, called the Open Minds Initiative.
Yeah.
You work in a public policy school.
Yeah.
You're at the center of some reforms that we're going to talk about, addressing some of the issues that conservatives and moderates, maybe in particular, have had with higher ed. So tell me about that. How do you end up at Mizzou? And what does the journey to the Open Minds Initiative look like for you? And what are you doing there?
Well, when I was on the job market, like anybody else in the job market, applied to hundreds of places, and Mizzou kind of just checks all the boxes for me. I was able to be in a policy school, which I really wanted to be. It's in a nice Midwestern college town where housing is cheap, and there's plenty of great brew pubs and coffee shops. And it's been a really pleasant experience here. I would characterize Mizzou as a pretty well functioning university. Um, Now, right before I got here, so I came here in 2016. You probably recall that the University of Missouri was somewhat ground zero, for a lot of campus unrest, because in 2015 there were encampments the way that you saw the last couple of years at other universities, and there was a lot of unrest between students and administration in terms of I think race relations and issues about campus climate. And the university did not do well through that situation. I mean, do you remember seeing this?
Yes, I remember seeing it on the news. So, for example, there was a large protest. The football team got involved. They ended up forcing the university system president and the campus chancellor to resign. And then 2 years later, in 2017, the New York Times wrote about how the partly related to the negative publicity that they got around that, they lost about a third of their enrollment from 2 years earlier, and they actually lost over 40% of their black enrollment, which is ironic in the sense that what was going on, that the unrest was about how do we be more inclusive, right, to minorities.
Hmm.
So in a way, Mizzou was at the center in 2017 of this news cycle about how these kinds of flashpoints around race and other kinds of issues and unrest can really harm a campus's reputation. And yet today, Mizzou is doing quite well. So tell me a little bit about what happened in between, and what part you've been able to play in it through your initiative.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can take credit for much. I mean, the great thing here is I think we've got really impressive leadership now. What really seemed, I wasn't here in 2015, but from everything I was able to see, the leadership was just awful during this time. I mean, I don't know if it was the chancellors or deans or president at the time, but it just seemed like the issue was really handled poorly and botched. And so when I came here, enrollment was down, which meant that budgets were down. So everything was difficult there for a while in terms of, they were buying people out to get early retirements, and there were certainly layoffs. And my understanding was that really nobody was happy. You talked about enrollment dropping, and I do think that we saw enrollment drop across the board. I think for black families, they saw Mizzou, and the narrative was that this isn't a friendly place for people of color. And I think that for some, conservatives, rural Missourians, it looked like a place that was full of unrest, and they didn't want their kids caught up in that. Um, what the university did in response to that, and I'm not fully aware of everything that's happened, but we have new leadership. We have a president who's been really done an admirable job in terms of, I think, really just walking a line of somewhat, I would call, even just institutional neutrality and clear rules and guidelines that we talk about so much in the media now. I think we've had that for a while. After the protests, they revised the free speech and expression codes at the University of Missouri. We basically have a version of the Chicago Principles up on our website that says that you have the right to free speech and expression on almost every matter here, and we hold this right as an essential component of the pursuit of truth. And with the exception of disrupting campus activities, this right is absolute. And I think having the clear policies and the clear guidelines is one step in that direction. I think having good leadership that is able to talk to students and talk to state legislatures and other interested stakeholders with respect and empathy for both sides has been incredibly helpful. And so, you sort of like fast forward to, let's just fast forward to 20, you know, a couple of years ago, I guess, is when the rest of the country started dealing with encampments and protests. So uh, quite a number of years after us, and we haven't had those types of problems. And I don't. It's not that we don't have students interested in these things, but for the most part, things have stayed very productive and very civil. Um, and prior to the national spotlight being on higher ed and whether higher ed is doing a good job in uh, protecting freedom of speech, protecting the right of students to protest, protecting Jewish students from civil rights protests. I mean, under that national narrative, we've been, I think, able to be a lot more proactive and actually just like leaning in to the things that are happening here and the things that we're doing well. So yes, you mentioned the Open Minds Initiative. That is, I talked to John Tomasi at the Heterodox Academy conference, who I know you are also friends with, and he was really really interested in what's going on here, because the way that he described it was that we're doing these things in partnership with university leaders, not sort of like in opposition to them or as some sort of thorn in their side, trying to remind them that campuses should be places where we celebrate a diversity of opinions. And I know that you have that happening in Wyoming as well, which is amazing. I know that Vanderbilt's done a really good job on this. And so, in terms of our own initiative, we kind of specifically called it the Open Minds Initiative in some ways because we wanted to distance ourselves a little bit from the civil discourse, civil dialogue movement that is kind of seems like so many campuses are in a rush to adopt right now. We started doing this work before that sort of bandwagon happened. And I'm also a little bit skeptical, if I'm being honest, making that sort of like the cornerstone of a campus reform movement. So, we thought deeply about this. I specifically, working with my dean and just really thinking like, well, what do we really want, to bring out of our students to prepare them to to go off and live in one of the most polarizing times in American history. And how are we going to get them to get along? We don't want them to just have polite conversations for the sake of being polite. We want them to approach things with open minds. We want them to approach ideas with humility. We want them to hear lots of different opinions and be able to consider them with charity. So that's a little of the flavor of what we're doing. Within that, for one, I teach a course that's kind of a controversial topics course where I have undergrads after lots and lots of practice and lots of discussion about the important virtues of learning to understand each other's point of view. We talked about everything imaginable last semester, from DEI to critical race theory to transgender issues to Israel Palestine. I show my syllabus to people at Ivy League institutions. They say, yeah, you could not teach that course here. But I know there are other great people around the country at institutions like mine teaching these types of courses. But the one course isn't going to do enough. So what we're doing with Open Minds is we actually have a cohort of classes across campus that participate in seminars that we put on that are open to the public. We're trying to bring the community in. We're trying to bring students in. And the cohort of classes that sign on to participate in the Open Minds seminar series, all of the students will come to these seminars. So like next month, we've got Greg Lukanoff from FIRE, who I'm sure your listeners know. The
Yeah,
next
Greg
month,
Lukianoff. Yep.
yeah. Oh, I didn't say his name right. Simon Cullen, who's also a mutual friend of ours, will be here the next month, and we've got a lot of great things like that planned. And so it's very much like a campus-wide shared commitment to these things. And I just think it's amazing to be in a place where you can do that, where we're not, meeting in secret somewhere, trying to come up with ideas that we can bring our universities back from the brink. We're openly embracing this because I think, because this is our job. And I know that I've heard good things out of Wyoming. I'd love to hear some of your experiences with this as well. But I think that this challenges the narrative that is being driven by some bad actors in academia. It's incredibly hard to know how widespread and how problematic some of the things are. Um, I know it hasn't been for me. It's been there's been a lot of stress watching what's happened on some campuses, but I hardly think that is the narrative of the majority of what's happening in college campuses in most classrooms.
Okay, so let's talk about the broader questions around campus reform.
Mm,
So I would say there's disagreements among people who see the need for reform to higher ed. Basically who think that the Trump administration and other critics from the center and from the right of higher ed have a point. They may disagree on the tactics and they may disagree on some of the specifics, but broadly, I've mostly seen agreement with what policies that people call the Chicago trifecta. So we should have robust free expression policies, which were required by the Constitution to have at public schools. We should have institutional neutrality policies, which you mentioned already, which means that the university does not, as an institution, and departments don't, as departments, take positions on contested social and political issues, although individual faculty and students are welcome to. Uh, and then the third one is what at Chicago is called the Shills Report, which is basically saying that we hire and promote only on academic qualifications and not on politics and not on race and not on gender, etc. So, one of the things I think is a big success here at the University of Wyoming is that we implemented all three of those policies, on our own without being forced to by the government. Uh, what does that look like at Mizzou?
Yeah, so we had already, after 2015, we had already kind of adopted the a statement very similar to the Chicago principles. In terms of institutional
And
neutrality,
that's free expression, just for those who don't know the
yes,
lingo.
yes, free
Yeah.
expression. In terms of institutional neutrality, uh, I think it's kind of it's one of those things where if you haven't been engaging in a neutral behavior, then maybe it doesn't. We've for as long as I've been here, I've felt like we had institutional neutrality. Um, it just has now never been that common for the university as a unit to make these broad sweeping statements. They probably did. I'm sure they did after the George Floyd situation, but that was a that was a big movement that I'm sure every university in the country issued a statement on. But in general, we had not been one of these statements. I don't know that we need to adopt an official institutional neutrality because I think it's just been part of
It's
practice.
just part of the culture. Gotcha.
Was the last thing that you were talking about in terms of hiring?
Hiring and promotion and I guess also admissions, post students refer admissions,
Yeah,
basically saying that we don't discriminate on the basis of race, gender, politics, or anything else in
yeah.
making professional evaluations and judgments. We only judge people on their academic qualifications and accomplishments.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one because I think most universities were had some sort of DEI initiatives where they would, whether that was making certain opportunity hires. I mean, the work that John Saylor has done on this is just kind of shocking, and I'm sure that you're familiar with it. John Saylor at the
Yeah,
Manhattan
I'm very
Institute.
John Seiler. Yeah,
Seiler, and I mean, foiling, some of the documents in these hiring reports, where they just kind of like they put in writing that they used race as indicators for hiring. Um, that is wild. To
and illegal. So one of the things that's interesting about the Shills report is that it more or less is the law, right? So
Yes,
so federal law. So it's always been illegal federally um, under Title VII to in hiring and Title VI in education to discriminate on the basis of race, Title IX in gender, Title VII for employment on the basis of gender too, I believe. Uh, and then under the First Amendment, it has always been illegal, since the court precedents around that stopped kind of the McCarthy era discrimination against socialists. It's been illegal under the First Amendment at public schools, at least, to discriminate on the basis of politics. So yeah, I guess what you're getting at is the Shills report is kind of strange because it's basically saying we're going to follow federal law, and yet, uh, as you pointed out, to John Seiler's reporting, Aaron Sabarium, Chris Rufo have also reported on these kinds of things. There have been widespread practices uh, over the last 5 to 10 years, at least, at universities that go against those legal principles. So, what
yeah.
what is your campus's stance on this?
Oh well, I mean, we eliminated like mandatory DEI statements for job applications several years ago, voluntarily. I mean, I'm sure that you could make an argument that the political winds, suggested this would be a good thing to do voluntarily, but we weren't forced to do it, and there was no major protest or unrest or anything like that. It happened fairly quietly. An email, went around campus that said, "Don't do this anymore," and then it stopped. I'll say that. Having been at the university while those statements and things like that were still being collected, um, so the general workaround here with DEI was that you couldn't hire based on race, but you could take something, you could look at the totality of what a person brings to a situation, and that a person's background and experiences could have some educational value for students. And I certainly heard that on campus, which I think we can quibble about whether or not that's legal or not, but we certainly have. I think there's something to be said for good faith efforts to try to bring in people who have experiences that can speak to the students that you're here to educate.
And this argument's come full circle recently with conservatives, right? So
Right,
so
right.
one of the viewpoint diversity, right, is one of the things that various organizations, to some extent, the federal government have been pushing. And there's been a debate about, okay, what does that look like? Does that look like affirmative action for conservatives? Uh, and if so, how's that any different, legally or ethically from what some of the things that were being criticized under DEI? On the other hand, are there areas of research that are not being done, uh, and courses that are not being offered because of the political demographics of faculty? I think, as you're getting at, that's pretty similar to what were some of the strongest arguments for the DEI push to diversify the faculty on other axes. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
But there's, of course, a fine line too, right? So, like, let me give you an example, right, of sort of where I think the line gets fine. So, I have no problem with, and actually would advocate for, doing a search in a discipline that is conspicuously absent from campus and probably would attract more conservative faculty than other fields would. So, for example, I would love to see more scholars of military history.
Hmm.
And I would love to see, more scholars of, Friedman-esque moral consequences of economic growth type stuff, right? More scholars of, American history, kind of focusing on the positive aspects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and similarly, I'm sympathetic to arguments that maybe came more from the left over the last 10 years, to the effect of, so for example, in environmental studies, like, why do we not have more scholars who study what's going on in China, which is, really going to drive the bus and a lot of big environmental issues, for better or for worse, and India, um, and in other places in what people call the global south, developing countries, in the tropics that may be most affected by climate change. And if you do searches in those areas, you're going to more likely than in other areas get scholars who are from, underrepresented minority backgrounds. In the other areas that I mentioned, positive angles in American history, military history, etc., you might be more likely to get conservatives than you would in other areas. That all seems fine. To me, though, when you talk about search committees saying, well, so and so, has a Christian background, that does not seem legal to me. Even though I do see, I have seen lots of searches that consider those kinds of things, more often in the last 10 years on, the axes of race and gender, again, in ways that kind of can sound more benign than, we want to hire this person because they're X, which I've also seen, I'm sorry to say, uh, but still sound a little bit like we're considering X trait, which is protected under the Civil Rights Act, right? What's your thought on where the line is?
Um, I mean, I'm probably always going to be the. I think that for me, what a person is researching is probably the most important. I think that's where we should align our priorities. Um, You're right. I think in the terms of universities should have goals about what the types of things are that they want to research, and they should find the best candidates to research that. Um, but this does go back to DEI in terms of those initiatives, because so many of the job advertisements that you saw, from whatever we want to put this time frame on, 2015 to 20 2022, something like that. I mean, there were so many job advertisements where they were asking for scholars that had a specific focus on equity and social justice, for example, being a couple of buzzwords. And I think that those were often code for a a political a desire to have people who were politically aligned with what the academy was going for. Particularly, I mean, not to go back to ed schools, but that's so common in ed schools to say that we want scholars focused on equity and social justice, which are you know clearly politically meaningful words that suggest a certain thing. Um, I mean, the other thing about, I think, DEI and just kind of the way that it unfolds is, like, I often, like, I think we have a lot of debates that are end up being purely navel gazing, like hypothetical debates about like whether this is good or bad, when the facts of that are somewhat different in terms of, did it actually work? And it actually, from the research that we do have, it didn't work at all. Um,
So be specific. What was the metric of success that wasn't met?
Well, so right. So the New York Times did the big expose on the University of Michigan, right? And so University of Michigan had spent almost, more than most any other institution on DEI efforts in terms of faculty recruitment and student recruitment, and the numbers didn't change at all. And I think maybe part of the issue here is that people committed to this ideology think that this can be somehow fixed at the level of PhD in academic hiring. I mean, the
Right.
true inequality that works in the world. But really, I mean, what I've seen more often than not is you still ended up hiring a white person who studied social, equity and social justice, right? And
Or you wanted to hire, a female, and you ended up hiring somebody with a trailing spouse and no children, right? Or you hired somebody who was from a minority background but had a privileged upbringing.
not without exception. I mean, I would be an exception, but more, in general, those people that are getting to the PhD level and are out on the job market, um, they're, they had more help than the people that didn't make it that far.
Well, this gets to, I think it's Richard Kallenberg, right? He's a longtime critic of affirmative action admissions, and he's actually quite a progressive person politically, and his argument is basically that this whole debate is a distraction from class, and class is the real issue. Let
Right,
me
right,
back
right,
up
right,
though,
right.
because I think, yeah, my recollections. The New York Times had this long report about University of Michigan's uh, big investments in DEI and their outcomes, and as you said, my recollection is that they didn't change the demographics much of their student body or their faculty. By some measures, maybe they made the climate a little bit worse in terms of things like tensions around identity, and certainly around hesitancy of people to talk to each other, across differences, which all seems kind of the opposite of what they want. And one of the thoughts that I kept having when reading this, and a lot of other stories about these issues at the Ivy League schools, is that flagship public schools, particularly ones that are less selective than say Michigan is, right, or Berkeley is. uh I actually think my experience has been, I've worked at a couple of those, right? University of Wyoming, it's quite a high acceptance rate. CU Boulder before that also is quite a high acceptance rate. um to some extent, I really see this strongly. University of Wyoming, to some extent, these schools have a better instinct for how to handle these structural inequalities than maybe some of the more elite schools have, right? So, for example, we have a ton of first generation students, here at University of Wyoming.
Hmm.
We get students who have all kinds of different levels of preparation in high school, which is a big part of the inequalities that we see at the national scale, right? To your point about the end of the pipeline, right? If K-12 is where a lot of the inequity is, you're not going to be able to fix that at the level of a faculty search, right?
Right.
Uh, but I find that schools like ours that have a lot of first generation students, have a lot of non-traditional students, have a lot of veteran students, um, end up building in some of these things uh, naturally that help people from less advantaged backgrounds. So, for example, academic programs that help people catch up in math and language skills, when they get to campus is one example I can think of.
Hmm.
Uh, and and they're not always called DEI. Um, Another thing that's really interesting is, University of Wyoming has a really strong focus on keeping costs down. I think our in-state tuition is something like $5,000 a year,
Hmm.
and if you're, a high-performing student from an in-state high school, there's this thing called the Hathaway Scholarship that uh, means that many of our in-state students attend here almost for free. That's a big part of diversity and inclusion. Like, does that resonate with you coming from a play? I guess I don't know how selective Mizzou is, but I believe it is a public flagship
Hmm.
state school that, some of the things that I think have fallen under the DEI banner that I would say are pretty uncontroversial, right? Just helping kids from all backgrounds get ahead, the American dream. Uh, do those things sort of feel more natural and kind of less politicized where you are, or am I just kind of projecting what I've seen at Wyoming and some other schools that I've
No,
been at?
no, it feels completely natural, and yeah, it's so we're a land grant university, and we have all kinds of things that honestly just seem like public service. I mean, there's this thing called extension, which I didn't even know what extension was until I came to this university, but just like literally all these types of programs that work with rural farmers or rural workforce development, working with disabled populations. Um, and I guess we could call that DEI, but the terms are kind of murky now, right? That's kind of like an unfortunate thing, is that these words kind of became twisted because there there are so many ways I think that we can do the ultimate thing, which is legal and is virtuous, which is trying to make sure that we're accessible to the most people possible, and that we're introducing, upward social mobility to the state. I mean, we're funded by taxpayers who are from across the political spectrum and across social classes. But it only makes sense, I think, especially at a public land grant university, for us to make sure that we're serving the people of the state, the people that are elected to oversee us, and the people that pay our salaries. Um, I feel that, I feel incredibly like that as a part of the culture at Mizzou. In fact, it would kind of, shocked me when I first came here that, one of the things I always talk about is like, when I got to Mizzou, is like everybody just kind of does their job because they seem to care about it. Uh, just a very pragmatic approach, not a lot of ego, not a lot of, navel gazing in terms of, uh, this idea that academics are somehow smarter and better than other people. Just regular people trying to do a good job for their community. So I think that is definitely an aspect of public universities that I hope is common. I'm kind of curious if you feel that way about CU Boulder. Um,
I was aware of the reputation, certainly, of being, quite strident and politicized, and certainly you do see some of that in other departments, and there was a lot of that kind of in the couple of years after 2020. So the Wall Street Journal reported in January on a large scale targeted hiring program that was pretty explicitly based, they were hiring faculty pretty explicitly based on race and gender. Uh, so yeah, there's definitely some of that, but there's also the uh, I mean, I really think that the undergrads, it still is a flagship state public school with a high acceptance rate, right? So my experience was always that, the to the extent that there were extreme politics in a few departments, it was almost always being driven by the faculty and the graduate students, and the staff kind of in certain areas. Whereas the undergrads were, I think, kind of fairly normal and
Hmm.
wanted to go about their lives. I mean, if you just look by the numbers, one of the best things CU Boulder ever did for DEI, for the diversity of its undergrads, was hiring Coach Prime to be the football coach. Right?
Hmm.
The I believe the black student enrollment shot up after that. Uh, but anyway, I don't talk too much about CU.
Yes.
Let me say Wyoming. One of the things that Wyoming has done that really impressed me, to the point about, like, there are things to help students that are disadvantaged, that are legal, that are uncontroversial, and I don't care if we call them DEI or not. When so there was some state scrutiny in 2024, like a little bit over a year ago, about DEI, and there was an effort to pass a state law that basically failed. It's a little bit complicated in terms of, line, what's a veto, what's a line item veto, what passed and what didn't. But let's just say that, the campus wasn't forced necessarily to do anything differently. Uh, and yet the president put together a task force, which I think in the span really quick time frame, something like a couple of months. This is just before I got there. They put together this I thought pretty incredible public task force report where they basically said, here's everything we do that falls under the DEI banner. And here, yeah, we acknowledge that there are these like five or six things that although they haven't been university wide policy, we admit that some departments have been doing it, and probably they shouldn't have been, including discriminatory hiring practices, mandatory DEI statements, unsanctioned land acknowledgments, and a couple of other things. But also, there's a much larger group of things that we do that fall under DEI, but are banal, uncontroversial things like Americans with Disabilities Act compliance, right?
Right.
It's kind of one example. Helping first gen students, helping veterans, and so basically, we're gonna close our DEI office, and we're gonna stop doing these things, these five or six things that we shouldn't have been doing, but we're gonna keep doing these other things.
Hmm.
And I thought it was two things I thought were remarkable about it. First was that they admitted publicly that they had erred. Right, there's a lot of one of the things that we're seeing now is there were a lot of campus administrators that I think went along with things they didn't really agree with in 2020, some of the more extreme stuff, and some of them are changing it internally, but kind of in a way where they're also trying to memory hole it a little bit, right? So, CU Boulder, in response to the Wall Street Journal report about their hiring practices, has paused the program that was problematic. They've brought in an external person to audit their hiring practices to make sure that they're legal going forward. They recently sent out a new hiring guidance that pretty much is the Shills report, saying you can't hire on race, gender, or politics. But they've also not publicly acknowledged that they were doing anything wrong before, right? It's sort of the language is like, out of abundance of caution, we think it was legal, maybe the practices weren't perfect, right? There's kind of this attempt to I don't know if it's memory hole it, or they're embarrassed to kind of admit that what happened. But you see this kind of thing at a lot of campuses, and so I think it's really remarkable that Wyoming, kind of without being asked, came out and said, yeah, we've done these things, which include breaking the law, right, if you sort of parse it, uh, and we're going to stop. And then the second thing that I thought was quite remarkable that Wyoming did, related to this report, was cutting through the noise of this divisive conversation where people talk past each other, where it's like like everything that's called DEI is bad on one side, versus if you criticize anything that's called DEI, you don't care about helping kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, and and giving everybody an equal opportunity. And I thought they really did a really good job just kind of cutting through the nuance there and saying, look, yeah, basically when the state says they don't like DEI, we think they mean these things.
Hmm.
We admit that we shouldn't be doing these things and we're going to stop doing these things, but we don't think they mean these other things and we're going to keep doing these other things.
Yeah.
So I was really impressed by that.
No, that is impressive. I mean, I think that the ship has sailed on trying to retain the terms. So there's, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, the DEI, it's unfortunate because like diversity is a very handy word that we use all the time, as is equity and inclusion. But I think there's those are tainted. Um, but yeah, the
It doesn't matter what we call it,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
what we should care about is what we're doing and whether or not it's helping or not.
Right, right. No, I agree. So I wonder if you have any thoughts then, like, why? So we're sort of talking about what we see as maybe more practical, more pragmatic institutions, state institutions. Why do you think it is that the Ivies have been, or elite institutions in general, have been some of the worst offenders in this stuff?
I mean, I have to admit, by direct experience, the honest answer is I don't know. In the sense that I'm Canadian originally. Uh, the schools that I've worked at or studied at in the U.S. were all big public schools. I was at Minnesota, and then Santa Barbara, and then Boulder, and now here at Wyoming. So I haven't attended a Princeton or a Harvard or a Columbia. So I'm mostly going what I've read, but I think part of it is elitism, right? I think about Rob Henderson's work, his book talking about luxury beliefs, and
Yeah,
Musa Al-Gharbi's book,
yeah,
We Have Never Been Woke.
right.
Right, they both describe experiences as kids from modest backgrounds themselves, who entered these elite institutions, basically seeing the seeing the desire to advance social justice become performative and counterproductive and sometimes downright silly because of the privilege of the people involved and the blindness that privilege led to, where it's like, back to your point about how the politics of your students don't correlate with race the way some simplistic narratives say that they should. uh, that's just obvious if you're at a school where, or maybe to put it differently, right? If you're at a school like Princeton or Harvard, where almost nobody is from a disadvantaged background, right? I think they have more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. I can't remember if that's Princeton or Harvard, but it's one of them. Uh, it's easier to trick yourself into having, strange and inaccurate ideas about what the needs and political beliefs of students from first gen and other disadvantaged backgrounds are, than if you just have those students as part of your population. I remember a student from an underrepresented background when I was at Boulder coming to my office kind of once in shortly after the 2020 stuff, basically saying that she felt like people were treating her like a helpless refugee, and sort of in an attempt to include her, and sort of she was feeling very excluded because she felt like people were kind of walking on eggshells, and her
Hmm.
professors were afraid to criticize her and things like that.
Right. N-
Um, so I guess that's my answer to your question would be, I think that non-elite schools have an easier time dealing with this stuff because we deal with this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I would have given the same answer. I mean, I think you're right with Henderson. There are these luxury beliefs, and this is a lot of this stuff is just like kind of elite discourse that doesn't affect the majority of college campuses. But of course, as you've said to me before, I mean, these institutions have outsized influences. So
Yeah.
as the elite institutions go, then all the other universities think that they somehow have to emulate that. But it's maybe I would add to your notion of that they just are disaffected by it and don't understand um, that due to their privilege. I mean, not that I'm speculating, but I think there could be like an aspect of guilt playing a role there too,
Oh, sure, right? I mean, this is America is the country where rich people, preen in their sweats and poor people preen with their gold chains, right? It's like
Yeah.
nobody wants to, own what class they're in, because there's all these kind of unstated deep tensions and divisions around class. Uh, let's go directly to the question of government intervention,
Yeah.
right? There's this. You and I are both members of Heterodox Academy. Uh, there's been, I think, a pretty heated at times debate in the last few months among people who think that there's a problem in academia that needs to be reformed, where some, where Heterodox Academy as an institution certainly falls, think that it's not the government's job to fix it, and Heterodox or sorry, academics need to fix it internally, because number one, independence from political interference is an important bedrock principle of academic freedom and of the academy, and number two, if academics can't figure out how to fix our own house, then any reforms that we see may not last beyond one administration to the next, as far as I understand the Heterodox Academy argument. And then on the other side, there's people, like the authors of the Manhattan Statement that came out that basically argue that, universities have demonstrated repeatedly over the past decade that they don't want to fix themselves. And in some areas, they don't want to follow the law, around things like discrimination. Uh, and it's the government's job to step in and enforce those things, certainly in the case of law breaking, but also in light of the fact that the government pays so much of, subsidizes so heavily schools of uh, higher education institutions.
Hmm.
It's not like the Hillsdale model is the norm where we don't take any government's money and we want the government to kind of stay out of our way.
Hmm.
So yeah, what's your take on that debate?
It's hard to talk about that debate without acknowledging, the elephant in the room, which is, you know, Donald Trump's tactics in the way that he approaches these things are so just kind of haphazard, and there's a lot of overreach. I mean, in terms of,
Be specific. What's, a lot of listeners who agree with you already are going to know what you're talking about, but be specific. What's haphazard and what's overreach in your view?
well, just like large scale canceling of government funding that wasn't just supporting, uh, research that was. Um, antithetical to the mission of the university, but just like large scale canceling of NIH and NSF grants that many of which are doing good things, large scale canceling of so many things that you and I, like you said before, might have just been efforts that would fall under a DEI rubric because they were trying to help underprivileged people with disabilities. I mean, it's just messy. And then, like the public fights with the Ivies seem like a lot of political theater. And in that, and the, this, it doesn't just bother me because I would like things to be more precise and intentional. I mean, it bothers me because I think it conflates some of the real issues with issues that aren't important or should not be on our radar. So it's kind of this, I want people to focus on the things that truly matter. So, universities that were literally doing illegal activities, obviously there's a government role there. I mean, one of the biggest ones for me, and clearly, at least one of the biggest ones that has been discussed in messaging from the Trump administration is the way that some campuses failed to protect Jewish students. And that, if we could have kept the messaging somewhat focused there, I think it would be a really productive conversation about civil rights. Yeah.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question there,
Yeah.
because I actually think the way you stated it, protect Jewish students, is fairly uncontroversial with the public, but then and with academic reformers. But then when you get into the specifics, there are actually some thorny areas, right? So
Hmm.
when you say protect Jewish students, there are kind of three broad things that I could think you might be talking about,
Sure.
right? So protect them from, literal violence and being prevented from going to their classes. blocking quads, things like that.
Right.
And I think most people would agree that they should be protected from that, and those things shouldn't have been allowed to happen. And campuses should enforce their own rules around time, place, and manner. And then the second thing is protection from, you know, maybe in some cases quite politically extreme, anti-Israel faculty members and public speech they were making that Jewish students found offensive. And then in the third thing would be, ostracism and nasty comments from their peers.
Hmm.
And I think in the first case seems to me to be quite straightforward, as universities were not following their own rules in ways that were making students, particularly Jewish students, unsafe. The other two seem like there may be trickier academic freedom issues. What's your thought?
No, I agree, but that's why I bring up that it's unfortunate that these have to be so conflated. I mean, the first one that you brought up, which I saw, rampantly at UCLA and at Columbia, like literally setting up barricades and checkpoints, and for not allowing Jewish students to walk across campus. That is as that is some of the most ugly mass behavior that we've seen in America for a long time. And that should have been an extreme focus. It should go down in history as similar to white racists in Little Rock in 1957 not allowing black students into public schools. Like, it was
Right.
so gross, and it should have been everybody involved in those universities and in power, who had power at that time, should be unemployed at this point. It was just unbelievable that happens, and that could happen in America in this day and age. And I would prefer the focus to be on those really clear violations of civil rights. But yes, it's expanded to other things that clearly are protected speech, and important to have those protections for those speech that is not necessarily pleasant, but that is falls within the boundaries of the First Amendment, obviously should be allowed. But the conflation, the overreach by the right, it's a terrible time to be a person with common moderate common sense values in the United States, because each side is kind of overreaching, retreating to these extreme views, to the point where I don't think anybody's having an honest, intellectually honest conversation about what we're actually doing. It just becomes political theater.
So let me pull the thread here a little bit, and I'm going to broaden out from the anti-Semitism issue, because I think that it applies more broadly to some of the issues we talked about. So it sounds like we would both agree that the federal government has a role to play in enforcing federal law, including contract law. So if universities enter into contracts with their students and faculty that say they're going to uphold their free speech rights, they're going to enforce time, place, and manner, they're going to protect public safety, things like that, then there's contract law remedies for some of these areas, like the encampments, for things like discrimination. The government should do this with due process, right? So I'm with you that they shouldn't be canceling grants willy-nilly as a threat in a negotiate as a salvo in a negotiation, right?
Hmm.
If they think that these universities are breaking the law, which honestly I suspect that they're right in some cases, right, with
Hmm.
things like discrimination, what they should be doing is opening Title VII investigations, publishing their evidence, and then putting universities under consent decrees where they have to publicly and transparently show that they've changed, before you take away their grants. And in some cases where they've already, committed past legal infractions, I think having some kind of settlement isn't necessarily bad, although, the size can be debated. Okay, but what about, and then, sorry, and then it also sounds like we agree that, free speech should be protected, right? And the, government shouldn't be, arresting or deporting people or taking away funds based on constitutionally protected speech. Okay, but what about this one, right? What about the argument that from the Trump administration and some, conservative state governments, that the faculty of some disciplines are pretty explicit about their political commitments to the left, and sometimes often, in fact, the far left, right, sort of to the left of the median Democrat. Uh, you mentioned education,
Hmm.
sociology, based on their professional association, is another example. There's a few other we could mention.
Hmm.
What do you think of the argument from folks in the Trump administration, people like Chris Rufo, that, why should, if you're engaged in an explicitly political partisan project, why should we give you federal money? What's your response to that?
Well, I think that, I mean, there's no, outside of there's no entitlement in this situation. I mean, there's no line in the Constitution that says that faculty have the right to do all of these things. The Constitution is about our role as private citizens. So, I mean, while I want to protect academic freedom, I have to recognize that it is still a political arrangement that exists mostly because we have, we have some contract with taxpayers and lawmakers that says that we're doing a job that is serving some public interest. So it can't be the just absolute that uh, that you get a job and you have a blank check to do whatever you want because your title is professor. I mean, I love that idea as a professor, but I don't. If I step back from it, I don't understand what the basis
Okay, but
would
well,
be
let me
for it.
unpack that. Right,
Yeah,
I think that because I think that what you're getting at speaks to both a what you might call, from the perspective of academia, a normative issue, and a positive or predictive issue.
yeah.
Right. So the normative claim, I think, among academic critics of the Trump administration, even some sympathetic to their diagnosis of the problems in academia, is that it's just really important to the health of academia as a fact finding institution and education institution that serves the public good to be protected from political interference in the same way that's important for the Federal Reserve to be protected from political interference. Um, and so that means that even if we think that, a particular field is abusing that privilege to some extent, or a particular department or school or whatever, uh, that the government cracking, we could still be against the government, explicitly saying we're going to move our money around based on ideology because of the slippery slope that we think that causes. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the normative question.
Hmm.
Where the other argument on the other side of the argument would be, well, normatively, why should we have, one party and one fringe aspect in some cases of one party's interest being subsidized by billions of dollars of public money
Hmm.
and not the rest of the country? I think the positive angle, which is kind of where you started your comment, is that whether it's right or wrong that the Trump administration is doing what they're doing with respect to these issues of, viewpoint diversity, it's extremely predictable that that was going to happen eventually to these fields if they let themselves kind of go down this road for long enough. Kind of Lee Jussum's "we tried to warn you"
Hmm. Hmm.
argument.
Hmm.
So, are you sympathetic? Like, where do you fall? It sounds like you agree with that, positive claim that I just made, but where do you fall in the normative claim?
I mean, I believe in the normative claim. The normative claim being that there should be protected. That there should be places that are protected from government interference. Right. That's the normative claim.
Yeah.
I mean, two. A couple of reactions to that. One is, sorry to have to point out hypocrisy, like instead of getting to the point, but a lot it's unfortunate that so many people taking that position weren't worried about political interference when it was coming from other places. So there
Sure.
was a lot of DEI language built into federal grant applications prior to the Trump administration, and outside of very very few people, everybody just went along with it. So there's an element of hypocrisy. I love that normative claim, and I believe if we could have abided by that normative claim and resisted government interference along a number of different aspects, outside of civil rights law and stuff like that, then we wouldn't be in the position that we're in, right? So part of this is that we haven't really been good stewards of that normative claim. So that brings us to the point of, well, if we can't be trusted with that power, is there a role for the government to take away that power? Um,
Yeah, what do you think is the answer to that?
I don't like it. I don't. I would prefer a market approach, to be honest. That's sorry to like lean back on some sort of like libertarian principle and maybe.
No, I mean, I've written about how I think there should be a market approach, so you're speaking my language, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but it's maybe it's somewhat unrealistic. But I think that it's we're seeing it, right? I don't know how the University of Austin is doing in terms of financials and recruiting and all that, but that is a market response that I think is something that I appreciate more because it actually just provides a competitive alternative to uh, the academy that may be captured because they have not been good stewards of truth-seeking missions. Um,
Okay, let me jump in here because you've mentioned the University of Austin, which for those listeners who don't know is a small university that has welcomed its first cohort of about 90 students last year. That was created as a foil in response to some of these trends of politicization in higher ed, and I don't think that on its the University of Austin I think is a interesting project that's worthwhile. It's serving tens to hundreds of students. It's on its own not going to be a market solution to this problem. But I actually see positive signs of market forces within conventional universities, right? So applications to schools in the Northeast are down and they're up, way up in the Southeast, for example.
mhm,
Some of the disciplines that are in the humanities that are kind of the epicenters of this politicization have lost, I think, half of their I think the stat is in the last 20 years, humanities degrees, the share of all degrees have gone down by about half. Um, there was a piece I was just reading about the history department. I'm not going to name the Ivy League school in case I'm remembering it wrong, but one of the Ivy League schools, history department has lost, I think, three-quarters of its majors, over the last decade or so as it made a sharp political turn. So I guess, yeah, I actually completely agree that on the area of you know, in the area of schools are breaking the law, the government has a role to stop it.
right.
On the areas of their teaching and researching and putting out ideas that we think are bad, I actually really agree with the idea that the market should be the main mechanism to fix that. And there are, I think, two areas where the government can play a role there. One is, the government does decide what the streams are for grants, right? So they decide, what are the things you can write proposals for. I do think that there can be a slippery slope if those get too politicized back and forth, DEI one cycle and anything but DEI the next cycle, for example. The other thing is they can invest in areas that they think are missing to create more choice, right? So,
Hmm.
two areas where I see this happening at the state level. One is in K-12 with the school choice movement.
Hmm.
By the time this airs, our previous episode will have been on discussing that in the context of Tennessee. Um, and, where you're seeing areas where there are compelling alternatives being created and where public schools are struggling with maintaining academic standards and maintaining basic student safety, you're seeing public school enrollment drop. Another area that's really interesting that I wonder if is connected to the boom in applications to schools in the Southeast is governments there at the state level have been investing in these civic centers.
Hmm.
University of Florida has one.
Hmm.
University of North Carolina has one. They're all kind of slightly different. Ohio State, I think, has a new one.
Hmm.
But broadly, they're of the flavor of we're going to get in social sciences and humanities, broad range of scholars from different ideological persuasions and student curriculum that's steeped in the Western tradition and constructive disagreement and things like that.
Yep. Yep.
Uh,
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, I fully
Your
agree.
program's an example, maybe.
I,
I'm not sure what its funding source
I
is, but
want, well, we don't have state funding, and with state funding comes, you know, some restrictions probably. But I know people at every one of those civic centers that you just mentioned, and I think this is absolutely right. Like the market is a self-correcting mechanism, and it avoids sort of like relinquishing so much authority to the federal government, which, you know, whatever, you know, however much you might agree with the Faustian bargain of cheering on this administration's attack on higher ed, it sets precedent that is not good for the future of government, you know, leaving government out of some of these situations. So yeah, we're in total agreement then on the market driven approach. I think that the you know, you're right. Also, you probably don't know this, but I've studied school choice stuff for like 20 years. So I'm a big proponent of school choice uh, as a way for, you know, there to be, you know, some external pressure that's outside of government pressure that can provide guardrails for making sure that what's being provided aligns with what the consumer is looking for. Um, so I mean, that does bring up, like, I think maybe an interesting question though is, if we just rewound 6 months, I guess, and um, we didn't have so much federal interest, intrusion, fighting with these different institutions, would the self-correcting mechanisms be working? I want to believe that you're right, that that the status of some of the institutions that have outsized influence is being diminished. I hope that's true, um, but you know, I haven't felt it yet. If there's any, I mean, if there's any, you know, large donors out there who want to give our institutions, you know, want to give Wyoming and Missouri some support here, you know, I just kind of, you know, we're still kind of at most of these institutions, we still have very low tuition, and we're kind of like overworked, and our facilities, you know, need a lot of help. And you know, and then when I visit elite institutions and I see, you know, kind of what's going on there, it's just, it's somewhat infuriating to me, um, in terms of just, you know, the way that influence is distributed. So I want to believe that you're right. And like, and another, you know, interesting facet about, you know, the school choice at the K-12 level, this is another example of, you know, the policy actually addressing those uh, who need those services. I mean, the if you know public opinion on school choice policies, it is Black and Latino families who support it far higher than white families, and it's
right.
because of who's actually being served versus the luxury belief of the white suburban families who think, nah, we don't need to have these types of options. My kids are doing fine.
Right, okay, I don't wanna go too far down the school choice rabbit hole because we have a whole other episode on that. But, you know, we're almost out of time. Just to wrap up, so first, let me respond to your semi-rhetorical question about whether we would be seeing some of the internal reforms that we've been seeing, over the past 6 months, if not for pressure from the federal government. I think the answer for sure is no.
Yeah.
Although I think we'd be seeing some. We did see some reforms gain momentum, you know, after I think the shock of post October 7th, where many people saw, you know, how ugly some of this stuff can really get in terms of the, you know, dozens of professors openly praising October the 7th. Um, but I guess there's kind of a false dichotomy between in this debate between the government doing too much and the government doing nothing,
Hmm.
right? The government can absolutely send a clear signal following appropriate due process and law to say we don't tolerate discrimination and other illegal behavior anymore. The government absolutely can invest in creating new choices that then allow the market to discriminate better between, you know, good programs and bad programs, right? that's government intervention, but it's not government intervention that violates academic freedom, that sort of erodes the, independence of the university. Um, so that's what I would say is, I think that there's a model for, it's not like, the government stays completely out of it or
Hmm.
the government takes over. There's a model for, where the government is right to intrude or not. Okay, the last question I want to end on is are you optimistic about the future of higher education in the United States? Why or why not?
Well, I have to be optimistic because that's why I get up every day. Um, so yeah, I am. I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic about. I mean, I'm optimistic about this country. I'm optimistic about the values that have sustained America for a long time through lots of difficult positions that we've faced and managed to come out better. And sometimes it is through some of the worst situations that we go through that we emerge better. Um, is that, does that optimism carry? Does that work 24/7? No, but when I'm out there and I'm doing the work, when I'm working with students, when I'm at Heterodox Academy, when I'm talking to people like you, I'm incredibly optimistic. You mentioned those civic centers, and and that might be an interesting idea for one of your future episodes, is to talk to some of these people. But I
Yeah.
see some of the best people that I know in my field are gravitating towards those, and I love to see it. And some of the things that are not, you know, that I think are problematic seem to be um, losing influence. So yeah, let's go with optimism. What about you?
Yeah, basically the same. I am unreservedly optimistic.
Yeah.
In fact, I have a, slow burning book project called How Polarization Will Destroy Itself, which I started about a year ago,
Mhm.
basically
You have to finish it
trying
before
to.
before it comes true.
Well, my prediction, which I made a year ago, which seemed more edgy than it does now, was that the far left would burn itself out first, and then the far right would be left fighting paper tigers and burn itself out too.
Yeah,
So I might I might end up getting that one right.
yeah,
And I have a public record on my blog, Guide Civic Revival, of that prediction,
yeah,
from a year ago. But yeah, I'm optimistic because the context of the country, I think that our core institutions of free expression, market competition, rule of law, are strong enough. I think are a much stronger immune system than people think they are, and they allow us to, I think, eventually sort out good ideas from bad faster than faster and more effectively maybe than people sometimes think. Right. So I think defund the police is a good example, right? Where uh, it gained it briefly gained ground in a few
yeah, yeah.
areas, who then had unfortunate experiments with not having police. Uh, and very quickly, I think it was 2021, for example, Seattle elected a Republican district attorney, right? Uh, bringing it back to higher ed, I'm optimistic for the same reason in higher ed. Maybe it's because I've worked at public schools, but when I'm in the classroom, there certainly are things that I read nationally, and maybe I see snippets of about issues with the young generation, challenges they're facing with technology, with coddling upbringings and things like that.
Hmm.
But the overwhelming impression I get from just teaching, particularly undergrad students, is they're very normal. They're not that different from what, my friends and I were like when we are undergrads. And, the vast majority of them have their heads screwed on straight. And so I think, having confidence in the people, I think, uh, allows you to have confidence in markets, right? In
Yeah, yeah.
free in a society that has free and fair elections, freedom of speech, market competition, and rule of law. Those are the four that I think are really important,
Hmm.
um, to sort these things out, right? To when governments go too far one way, to throw them out and try something new, the next time, and gradually iterate. And it's messy. It's not that, I think, was it Churchill who famously said that democracy is the worst
Hmm.
system except for all the other ones.
Hmm.
Right? I really believe in that. I really believe that applies to all of the core institutions of Western liberal democracy that we have. That it's not always pretty, but we eventually figure it out. And with higher ed in particular, people are betting their futures and tens of thousands of dollars of theirs or their parents' money on their education. Are they really going to put up with stuff that's not helping them accomplish those goals forever? No, they're not.
Right,
And I
right,
think that we are seeing
right.
those patterns in the long run. So I'm optimistic. Plus, not to mention the fact that scientific research in the United States has literally saved billions of lives,
Hmm.
and is producing incredible breakthroughs. I was just reading today about a new mRNA treatment that in a clinical trial was able to cure glioblastoma, which is one of the worst types of brain cancer. So so yeah, I'm optimistic. I think we're going to figure
I
it out.
mean, I agree with that. I think I would add one, just caveat to that, as picking up on the word that you used, immunity, because I agree, in terms of the American experiment, we have had this, immunity towards sliding towards autocracy and towards, um, violations of the rule of law and all the things that we hold dear about, liberal democratic values. But not all immunity comes naturally. A lot of immunity comes from vaccines. Not to get into another topic, but that's also controversial now. And so it is up to us and other educators to provide those vaccines, and that to be able to inoculate against some of the worst tendencies of human behavior, because I don't think that they just happen natural. If they were natural, the whole world would be following those
I agree. We need,
procedures.
I think, put another way is, our institutions that I mentioned are our immune system, and we need to do whatever we can to preserve those institutions.
Right.
That said, I do think in the context of campuses, because people spend so much money and invest so much
Yeah.
in coming here, my experience has been that students do selectively seek out the courses that are challenging them. We
Hmm.
were talking before we came on the air about various courses that are transgressive and have become enormously popular and have gotten national acclaim. Like Ilana Redstone's
Hmm.
Bigots and Snowflakes course, for example, at University of Illinois, I believe.
Yeah.
All right, last word to you. Anything you want to say before we sign off?
Well, I'm just glad that we're leading on an optimistic note, and thanks for having me. And let's keep working on this experiment, because I think the sort of like natural self-correcting process that you're describing and that we both hope exists. I think this is it. We're doing it. We're
Great.
doing it.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Matt. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.